Ladies and gentlemen and Professor Black, I would like to welcome you all to this lecture. It's really pleasant to see the good turnout and how many of you could find your way through the fog today. This good turnout is perhaps not surprising, as Professor Black will be addressing a topic today that is highly relevant. It is the responsibility of the individuals who were involved in the decision-making in the business community prior to the collapse of the major banks, as well as the persons who make these decisions possible. Now, Professor Black does not need an extensive introduction on my part, but I would like to mention here he is a professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri. For 2 years period, he was the executive director of the Institute for Fraud Prevention, but more importantly, he was a litigation director of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, as well as a deputy director of the National Commission on Financial Institution Reform, Recovery and Enforcement, amongst other things. And please forgive me, Professor, if I've left out some relevant information. But I mention this especially to highlight that, as well as having extensive knowledge on the subject, he more importantly has a practical experience on the issue that he will be discussing today, on holding the abusive and fraudulent elites and enablers accountable. So having said that, Professor, the floor is yours.
So we have to stop meeting like this. I can promise one improvement over yesterday. You will not be inflicted with any PowerPoints. Yes, exactly. We've all had too many in our lives. I'm also going to, in response to some very good things that people suggested from the audience yesterday, broaden my topic a bit to look a little bit more at the future, not entirely at the past, and to talk about how one creates a more effective means of preventing this from happening again. Now, part of the recovery is deterrence to reduce that risk, but there are other things as well. And what I'm going to do is tell you from a background of failure, because I'm going to tell you all the things we did wrong. Well, actually, I don't have time to do that, but I will tell you the high points of what we did wrong in the hopes that you will not emulate our mistakes, but try more of the things that worked better. All right? So we did a very great deal wrong, which is why when I was litigation director, I had a docket of 10,000 cases. Right? You can imagine that doesn't reflect well on the United States or the savings and loan crisis. So I will begin with the same warning for those that saw me being interviewed on Silfver, and that is, there is no giant pot of gold that you're going to get back through asset recovery, where, you know, that suddenly 50% of the losses will be found being partially Irish, you can't follow the rainbow and look for the pot of gold. It isn't going to happen. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't work very hard at asset recovery, because you can make a material amount of money losses back, and that's part of our job, right? If we can get 5% back of a very large number, we've earned our salaries for a very long time. And more importantly, you have to do it for fairness, and you have to do it for deterrence, that people cannot look back at this crisis and say, look where he is now. He's rich, he's powerful, he's in the top magazines, his kids marry well, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's worked out just fine. If you allow that, you're just asking for you're extending an invitation that says, cheat us again next time. So let's talk, and I'm going to broaden it just beyond just civil, because I'm going to talk about enforcement actions, which is a third category. And it's a category where we ultimately found we could have our best impact in many ways. And I think it's a less explored, less developed alternative at this juncture in Iceland. So these administrative actions, these enforcement actions, are when the agency, this would be the FSE, brings an action itself. Not an action in court, but an administrative action in front of what we call an administrative law judge, who has the benefit of being expert in financial matters. Right? And that can be enormously important in your ability to explain things and to handle a much greater volume of cases as well. So let's start out with that which I'm not going to talk about much at all, and that is the criminal today. The criminal justice authorities have the ability to recover assets inherently. And if they are successful in convicting people, or if they reach an agreement where there will be a plea, a guilty plea, you can negotiate as an Icelandic Justice Department official, a special prosecutor in this case, an agreement under which assets are repatriated to the treasury of Iceland. So there's a huge role for prosecution in asset recovery as well. Not what I'm talking about today. Similarly, your tax authorities have an important role. And they, too, have some broader powers. And tax evasion is absolutely the norm in cases like this. And so that's a big part of the story as well. But there are people far more expert than I, and to even use the word expertise in me as to Icelandic tax laws is, I know nothing about them, all right? So have speakers come and tell you about how to use the Icelandic tax laws as part of the recovery. I'm going to focus on civil, and I'm going to focus on administrative. In the civil context, what we discovered was that if we played it the usual way, which is we do an investigation for a year and a half, we get all the facts, we bring the case, that there wasn't much there left by that time. One of the difficulties when you're dealing with these kinds of thieves is that their marginal propensity to consume is always above 100%. That's the definition of greed. However much they have, they want to spend more. And so if you wait years, they're very good at destroying wealth. You may have noticed that. They are very good at buying toys for themselves that, like a Premier League football team, for example. What a great way to destroy wealth. A money-losing team, but it's good for the ego. And these guys are largely about ego as well as dollars. And so we began bringing freeze actions. Now, a freeze action does not seize the assets, but it says you must tell us all your assets, and you cannot move them, and you cannot spend them all. You're on a budget. Enough to live, enough to pay for a legal defense, but you're on a budget. And we were very successful in getting those kinds of orders from the courts. Now, in the U.S. context, I'm going to talk a bit anally here, but doubtless there are some lawyers who want to be inflicted with this in the audience. We do first what's called a temporary restraining order, which can be valid for 10 days and can be extended for another 10 days. And sometimes we would even, this is controversial, might not be allowed under human rights provisions, we would do this what's called ex parte. That means without their involvement. We would go to the court and say, these are people that are engaged in fraud, they're engaged in things that would hide assets, move assets out of the jurisdiction, maybe to England, maybe to tax havens and such, and we want an order that says, freezes them and says they can't do that and they have to identify their assets. Right? That has probably obvious, enormous benefits. They're not there to argue against you. And you should only use it in very special circumstances where you have a sincere belief that there's a very grave danger of assets being hidden, or as we say, dissipated, because that's a really long way of saying it. Right? That it can be followed by a preliminary injunction in the United States context. And again, I'm not an expert on Icelandic law, so you're going to have speakers who are expert in Icelandic law and say, this is what we can do and this is what we can't do under the Icelandic laws. But these are certainly provisions that have passed constitutional muster in the United States, and the United States has very significant constitutional protections for defendants and isn't particularly hostile to business people, as you may have noticed over the history of our country. And these have been permitted. So it certainly has a possibility. If you do these actions, then you enormously change the dynamics of the case. A preliminary injunction, if it's granted, lasts until the trial is over. And suddenly their toys, their ability to spend whatever they want, is threatened. Suddenly they either have a choice of lying when they're told to identify their assets, which is a felony in the United States and can have them go to prison for considerable years, or telling people where their assets are. And they don't want to do that. I know this is a shock to you. And that's precisely the position you want to put them in. Right? Now, there are other ways of doing this. You can have a parliamentary inquiry. And you can say, we want to know what your assets are. You can do it confidentially, right? That doesn't have to be broadcast to the entire world. But I don't know even preliminarily whether that's... Has the government of Iceland formally asked the heads of the bank to identify their assets? Well, that would be a good start, right? And again, it tells you an enormous amount. They frequently lie, which gets them in a bit of considerable trouble. Makes them look awful in a criminal case if they're lying about their assets and trying to hide them. That is typically admissible in the United States in the criminal trial because it shows evidence of an evil intent. And indeed, that's a feature of this talk in general, that all of these things need to work in coordination. These things being civil, criminal, and administrative actions, and also, of course, the tax actions that I talked about. If you just do it as different, we call stovepipes, that don't communicate, don't work together, you will be enormously ineffective. And we know because that's how we did it. Again, back to mistakes learned. We tried it the other way. Doesn't work very well. You need the groups working together consistently, formal lines of communication, regular meetings. There's some things you can't share because of confidentiality provisions, but you need the folks all on the same page working together. You can't afford rivalries in all of this among the governmental people dealing with the problem. Or at least, some rivalries are probably inevitable in life. You minimize them, you get on with the job. All right, so if you get this preliminary injunction, this freeze order, they suddenly become very interested in settling the case with you. And now I bring to you the trade-off. If you have someone doing a very good job bringing these civil suits, they will be faced with decisions where there is no perfect answer. And you will criticize them. And you will feel that you're perfectly appropriate, that they've betrayed you, because they will settle for 5 cents on the dollar or 10 cents on the dollar. That's all right. We're used to getting complaints. But you need to make your best professional judgment, and then you have to make an important policy question. How much is it willing to worth to the government and people of Iceland to pursue this action, even if net we're going to lose money? Now, let me be clear on what I mean by net. Say you are offered a settlement of €1 billion for losses from fraud of, let's assume, €10 billion. That's a 10% recovery. In some ways, that sounds awful. Right? But if they're not getting away wealthy, if the $1 billion essentially takes the money they have, then the question is it worth pursuing the action and getting an actual judgment saying, yes, a civil judgment, these people engaged in fraud? And what you have to weigh as an attorney, of course, is you may lose that action as a plaintiff. And in particular, frankly, you might lose it in Iceland, given the judiciary. Right? It may be quite hostile compared to, for example, the United States in your ability to recover. And so you may be baying for the blood of the government lawyer that recommends a settlement at a mere 10% and still, leaves the person not completely in the poorhouse. And they're not going to want to settle for completely in the poorhouse, because what's the point? If you're telling them that you're going to put them out on the streets as homeless people, they don't have much incentive to settle. So I forewarn you that you can start out with great support, overpacked rooms, have people absolutely represent your interests, and then go be faced with cutting a deal that may make you very hostile to them. And again, you have to have people in charge who are willing to take that. And that's tougher, again, in a closer society, because you may see people 7 times a day walking simply to work who will go, right? So you have that ahead of you if you bring the action. Now, let's back up another moment. Recovery is nice, but to recover, if you're going to have a contested action, you got to win. So what can you win in a civil suit? Fraud requires additional elements of proof compared to many other civil wrongs. It can be a tougher burden, in other words, to prove it. If you can prove fraud, you can get greater recovery, typically. You may be able to seize all of the proceeds. of the fraud. So if you go and you win a contested case, you may be able to literally leave them in the poorhouse, because you may literally take all their assets. Right? And again, you have to weigh what you think, how important you think that is in terms of fairness and deterrence, but you got to be able to win. And you shouldn't assume that it's, well, you just go forward. I mean, Black gave this speech, said it's fraud. We just walk in, we say it's fraud, and it's all over. No, you'll face many of the best lawyers in the world. And you, if it's here, you'll face it with a judiciary often hostile to the entire concept of holding such people responsible. They can't be frauds. They're respectable. In fact, they were uber respectable people. They were the people who were championed, praised for years here in Iceland. Everyone wanted to be like Mike, we would say, Michael Jordan, but here it would have been the people running the big three. And so if you go with this action, you go strong, we would say. We say in basketball, when you go up through the crowd to try to do a layup, and there are 6 giant people hacking at you, go strong, go up strong. Anything else, you shouldn't bother to even come. And that means years of work by people who are exceptionally expert in financial matters and investigative skills. And at the end, what they have to be really good is take all that complexity and make it understandable. So we as lawyers are in the business of telling stories at the end of the day. True stories, we believe, but a story, a narrative. Why did this happen? That ordinary people, because that's really what judges are. They don't want to believe that, but they're at their best ordinary human beings, representatives of the community that know a bit about law. But law isn't the important part. It's, do they understand? Are they willing to listen to a story that makes sense about how people cheat deliberately? And this is against the entire instincts and way of people thinking. And they just can't conceive, in many cases, that someone would deliberately destroy a bank. That strikes them as completely irrational. We know that they're wrong. We know it from economics. We know it from criminology. We know it from regulators. And we know it from court cases, where that's exactly what they did. Took actions like not underwriting, like not requiring people to actually pay interest, like refinancing every loan that comes bad. I'm reading the report to you. But I'm doing it in the kind of way we do it in a court, of explaining those are actions that no honest firm is going to do. Those actions must destroy the firm. And again, Akerlof and Romer's title says it all. Looting bankruptcy for profit. The destruction of the firm is an inherent part of the fraud scheme. But that seems incredibly bizarre to everybody almost everybody when they first hear it. It seems weirdly conspiratorial and such, right? And those bad novels you pick up before you go on an airplane, because you don't need to turn your mind on when you read them and such. But this isn't. This is very sound, established over at least a quarter century now, recurrent in many different countries, right? And so you have to actually be able to win the case. And in any discussion of recovery, I have to start with the ability to win. And even if what you're going to seek is a settlement and not a full contested case, Settlements are based on what's the strength of your case and how willing and able are you to bring that case. And so you need champions. You don't need screamers, ranters and ravers, but you need very solid people who are absolutely fearless and are really good at both detail and then the absence of detail. Not the absence, but the going beyond detail to what does this story really tell us? Not just a million facts. All right, so that's part of the recovery struggle. Part of the recovery struggle is if you do win, then you have this small little thing called remedies. It's a whole area of law. And we always, when we train young lawyers, emphasize it's real nice to win the case, but unless you collect, it's not so satisfying at the end of the day. And your law practice fails and such. So, recovery. Recovery is always going to be, in this kind of huge case, three really big things. One, where are the deep pockets, as we phrase it? Where are people that can actually pay very substantial amounts of money? And in this context, that's going to break down, and as it did in our context in the United States, into two major areas. One area is going to be people who have insurance. These will be law firms. These will be outside accountants. These will be the appraisal. I'm sorry, actually appraisals, yes, but and the bigger one might be the rating agencies. Right? As I noted, I think yesterday, we got over $1 billion in recoveries from the top tier audit firms in the savings and loan crisis. And we got over $500 million, I think well over $500 million from major law firms. You can imagine how popular I was among my fellow lawyers. And again, you need people that don't care about that. Right? It's part of the job. You do your job. There are lots of bad things. You know, the other jobs you stand out in this wonderful Icelandic weather all day. Right? You get paid a little better as a lawyer, so why not? The other deep pocket, of course, is people that really do have substantial proceeds from the fraud. I warned already that they tend to consume their assets at an extraordinary rate. And so they are the folks where you often need to go first, just in terms of timing. But if you're going to collect on insurance, you have to follow a number of procedures to put people on appropriate notice, and you have to do it in a certain time frame. And so you need people who are expert in whatever the relevant insurance law, presumptively primarily Icelandic, who make sure you have a timeline. And that's one of the things you have. Big civil case, big criminal case. Big timeline on a board like this. What do we need to do? When do we need to do it to be able to go to the next step? Because if you fail to do this one, you do 2 years of work and go, I can't bring my claim anymore. All right? That's malpractice on our part. And we strive very, very hard to avoid that since we're accusing others of malpractice. You know, it's this hypocrisy thing. But it's also critical to your case. So you need to be following whatever the requisites are of going after insurance. There are typically a couple of different kinds of insurance policies that you're going to be going after. One is for officers and directors, and it typically protects them against allegations that they were negligent or that they breached their fiduciary duties of loyalty and care. This one gets real tricky because often it doesn't cover fraud. And they'll say, if you're alleging fraud, there's no coverage. So you need multiple claims, some of which sound, we would say, sound in negligence in the United States context. In other words, they're negligence claims and they're fraud claims, and you need to have both of them going simultaneously in your lawsuits. So that when they go, oh, no, we stand over here, not over there, you can say, good, we have a claim against that as well, right? Because otherwise that's exactly the dance that they're going to do. The other dance they're going to do in these is that typically these policies pay the plaintiff only if the plaintiff wins. That would be some variant of the government of Iceland. But on top of that, only pay you what's left after the legal expenses have been paid. You can see how this creates a perverse incentive to settle cheaper. Because if you fight with them, the insurance is going away as they fight you. And so they want to present a picture of, I don't care. Come at me. You're just destroying your insurance policy when you make me have legal fees. Right? So, again, that can lead to settlement discussions that the people will go, what are you talking about? This is a huge company. It had a huge insurance policy. Why are you settling for 30 cents on the dollar? Well, that's why we settle for 30 cents on the dollar sometimes. And again, I know you'll be upset. I understand. It's my job not to be too upset that you're upset with me and think that I'm a terrible person and such. So you need people willing to make those hard decisions and willing to take the criticism. Those are most likely will be your biggest form of recovery. Because a number of the deep pockets here are not insured by Icelandic companies. They are big entities that have much larger insurance policies elsewhere. So, of course, insurance is meaningless if I sue you and you're insured, but when I get to the insurance company, there's nothing there. And again, we have to look at that always in asset recovery. It's nice that there's an insurance policy. Can they really pay? Here, the good news in terms of the auditors is they probably could pay a very substantial amount of money. So they're going to be, I would guess, certainly in the U.S. context, they would have been our prime target on civil recovery. Right? Now here you have many more targets than we would have had in a typical case, because here you have the cronies. Right? And the cronies are in league with the main fraud. And that means, in U.S. context at least, that we could hold them liable as aiders and abettors of the fraud, or even co-conspirators, if the evidence established that. And these cronies likely have very substantial assets. Now, they too tended to be very good at destroying wealth, as you know. But they own many companies still. And at a minimum, you should be able to get all the companies back out of their hands. Now, the question is whether you want them back. You don't want to take on a net liability. So again, you might find a lawyer, like the Icelandic counterpart of me, saying, we're going to cut a deal where we don't get back 3 companies. And you may think, the guy's obviously in the pocket, he must be a third cousin of. Well, not necessarily so. There may be really good reasons not to take back companies, because they may really be bankrupt. That, I think people have seen that possibility of late. Right? So, and you shouldn't trust their financial statements. I would not simply cut a deal in which I relied on the financial statement to say, oh, this company is great. It has, a $2 billion capitalization, stock market capitalization. Yeah. Okay, so again, we can hurt you. If we do our job wrong in asset recovery, we can hurt you by taking on net liabilities when we thought we were getting assets. And we issue a press conference and we got back this corporation, and 3 years later you find out it actually cost the people of Iceland 6 billion krona. All right, so you have to be, in this kind of case, ultra careful about your negotiations when you're doing your asset recovery. Far more than in other contexts. Right? So you need lawyers who are also have excellent business skills. There are fewer such people in life, right? And who have integrity, and who are willing to take the public wrath of settling the case. I'm sure you have thousands that fill this. Right? All right, so that's asset recovery as to auditors and as to the key issues on the cronies. Well, who else do we got? We got the main targets. And pretty much I've discussed them earlier. The main target, the issue is going to be, how badly do you feel it's critical to get a civil judgment that says they've engaged in fraud? Because otherwise you're going to cut a deal. And when you cut a deal, a settlement, they're not going to admit having done anything wrong. And because of that, they may be willing to give you more money. So again, it's a trade-off, no great answer, you'll be mad whatever way we do. Go. That's all right. We want you engaged. Right? We'd rather have you critical of us than ignoring us and not paying attention to these things. Because unless the people of Iceland, and I mean recurrently, demand that this get done, it isn't going to happen. Not necessarily because of any evil people, because the easiest route is always going to be not taking on effectively these folks or excusing it. And here's a hint. There is no such thing as a perfect prosecution or a perfect civil case. And we win prosecutions because, despite imperfections, over 90% of the time. But if a judge wants to find something, there's always something, if that's their goal, that they can reach out and say, no. Okay, who else do we have? Lawyers. One of my favorite topics, suing lawyers, which again makes me so popular in the United States. Lawyers, the key is you may have a real, actually you have this with auditors as well, I should have mentioned it. The auditors could be your best witnesses. Because the auditors, and I mean both the internal and the external auditors here, they can deliver the big three to you. The CEOs and the senior officers and the cronies. If the auditors ever talked, frankly, honestly, they would blow this apart. So that's the other major issue. What if they agree to assist the prosecution at some point? That may be worth enough that you get next to nothing from them, or at least, small beer from them as a recovery. And again, you may hate us when we cut that deal. But you can see why that deal might make sense, I think. And you can see why it would hurt and be painful, and we wouldn't like it, and you would hate it as well. But that's another possibility, and that's a possibility, of course, as to lawyers, except that lawyers never do this. Auditors sometimes plead because we catch them in things where we can actually prosecute the auditor. And then in the United States context, as you probably know, we do plea deals, as 90% of our cases are resolved by pleas. And we would, if that person could give us very valuable information, we would have a minimal criminal penalty against that individual. Although typically, I must say, we would still insist that they plead guilty to a crime. And that would be good, because so far in our crisis, in your current crisis, we have how many arrests? How many convictions? Here or the United States? You pick them. We got 0. All right? And I promised to talk about administrative, and I promised to talk about going forward. The administrative, we found, ultimately was the single most effective way of doing the asset recovery. I doubt that under Icelandic law, you'd be permitted to use this retroactively. But I don't know Icelandic law. But I would urge you to consider adopting provisions similar to what we use after bitter experience of failure. Again, we tried lots of things that don't work. This one works pretty well if people use it. And here are the 3 key administrative powers that you could have. And remember, this would go to an administrative law judge who would be expert in the industry, expert in financial matters, as well as the law, and then goes to the commission. That would be FSC in this context, which would actually issue the order. It could then be appealed to the court system. But until that point, it's done within the administrative body. Here are the key 3 things. 1, removal and prohibition. Removal and prohibition is, as the name implies, we take an officer, an employee in a regulated industry, and we say, 1, you're fired. That's the removal. And 2, you can't come back into this industry for 10 years. That's the prohibition part. And we did this to hundreds of executives in the savings and loan context. Hundreds of them. Right? The second is a cease and desist order. And that, as the name implies, says you are doing something unsafe and unsound or in violation of the law. We are ordering you to cease and desist doing it. And we have the authority to issue a temporary cease and desist order. This kicks in before any hearing and says, now, you've been served with this order, you shall stop, for example, making loans without underwriting them, making loans to insiders, buying your own stock, refinancing your loans. All of those things you could have ordered cease and desist, and with a temporary cease and desist order, you could do so within hours of discovering a problem. Now, a temporary cease and desist order in the U.S. context, you can challenge it immediately in the court systems. Right? You need some system of fairness where rule of law applies. And that's how it's done. And this has been held to be constitutional in the United States context. And indeed, cease and desist can actually mean you must take action. So it can be cease and desist from failing to take the following action that you're required to take under the law or to run a prudent institution. The third major thing that we have in our arsenal is civil money penalties. In essence, this is a fine assessed by an administrative agency, again, appealable to the courts. But that fine, in the U.S. context, can be $1 million. So that's non-trivial. And as part of a cease and desist order, we can order you to pay back any assets you've taken. We can order you to pay back income you've received through bonuses that were derived through accounting fraud. These cease and desist orders are the single most effective of these 3 in transforming an industry that's out of control into one where the regulators actually can be effective. Now, a caution, all three of these powers existed during the current U.S. crisis. They simply weren't used. You put people in charge who, like Chainsaw Gillerin, they will not use the authority. They will not make criminal referrals. We just had a major investigative report coming out finding that 2 of our key agencies made 0 criminal referrals during an epidemic of fraud. They didn't simply deregulate and desupervise, they decriminalized the industry with no authority, of course, to do that. Okay, so powers, of course, effective powers never guarantee that they'll be used. But you need the effective powers, and then your focus has to be on the leadership of your administrative body. Is he or is she willing to vigorously use this authority against the most powerful business interests in your nation when it's warranted? And it's real simple. If you can't answer yes to that question, you can't put that person in charge of FSC. If they're not willing to take on anyone, they can't do the job. If they can, look at how you can use these things in conjunction going forward. As soon as, and this includes, by the way, even if the international accounting rules, which are a scandal, are not changed, and even if the EU rules on self-dealing are not changed, and they're a scandal, you could use these powers saying that's an unsafe and unsound practice. So the authority under the administrative powers isn't simply to violations of law or regulation. It's to anything that is unsafe and unsound. Now, that authority could be abused. It's a powerful authority. So the other thing that you must demand from your top regulators is self-restraint and integrity. You must never use these powers because somebody is of a particular political party that you disfavor. That will destroy your system. It will bring it into complete contempt. But if you put these together, and you need, going forward, you're not going to have a special prosecutor. You need an effective economic crime specialty unit, which you have. You know, at least on paper, you have such an organization. You need to make sure that it's staffed and that it is led by people who believe in it. I think you have the second. I don't think you have the first here in Iceland right now. Right? But you need a cadre of people who have specialized expertise in economic crimes. The average lawyer cannot function effectively in this area. They need to be specialists. They need additional training. They need to work together with your regulators, because only the regulators can have we would say, the hand on the pulse and understand how things are changing. You've seen what happens if you wait even a year too long with a place growing 50% a year. It's a catastrophe. You need people willing to act decisively. And only the regulators will have that information and can assist going forward the prosecutions. By the way, they're assisting now, the regulators, in providing referrals. And they've been very helpful to the special prosecutor. So I think I'll end there in terms of timing. And thank you very much.
I have been informed by very reliable sources that during Professor Black's work at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, a memo was written by the noted Charles Keating. Charles Keating is known for his active role in the loans savings and loan scandal or crisis in the 1980s, and at the time, well, he wrote this memo, and at the time he was under investigation. It is a brief memo. It's to one of his lobbyists in Washington. It says, highest priority, get black. Good grief if you can't get right in Congress to get black. Kill him dead. You ought to retire. So maybe that is why, well, what Professor Black referred to as being not so popular, that might be one of the symptoms of that illness, or so to speak. Now, we have...
Can I do 30 seconds of
yes.
Explain? The Wright references Speaker Wright, and one of the proposed ethics charges against Speaker Wright was the effort to fire William K. Black. And he is our second most powerful elected official in America at the time. So we live in an interesting country where you can survive sometimes, even when extraordinarily powerful people are gunning for you.
Now we have 35 minutes for questions, and I would like you to ask Professor Black. He will answer one question at a time. Please keep your questions brief and to the point if you can. So, yes?
Professor Black, thank you again for an excellent lecture. My name is Ben Knopfler. I have a follow-up question from yesterday. First of all, if they haven't offered you a job, can we hire you as a supervisor? But second of all, I'm not sure how much of the truth that you're telling us is actually applicable here in Iceland, because we have very naive laws, mostly based on a bad translation of Danish confusion.
I knew it would come back to blaming the Danes.
But it was actually our translation, so it's our fault. But I just want to know, of the 1,000 elite people that you got in jail in the 1990s, how many of those were abettors? How many of them were accountants? How many of them were bankers? How many of them were actually state or federal employees?
There were no state and federal employees convicted. They were overwhelmingly bankers. Of the 1,000, I would guess 600 were actually savings and loan executives. The others were, as you say, aiders and abettors. There were several prominent lawyers, and there was one accountant that I know of that was actually convicted.
Yeah, as well.
My name is Ólafur Hannibalsson, and I thank you for the lecture yesterday and today. I want to make one point. In one of the books about the collapse by Guðni Jóhannesson, it is mentioned that when the Icesave business was started, first in Britain and then in Holland, Landsbanki Íslands had a scheme to introduce such accounts in 11 other European countries. Now this looked to me like a typical Ponzi scheme where you would promise higher interest to people and then go to another country to get money to pay higher interest. Would you think that there was a legitimate reason to investigate this as a Ponzi scheme on a gigantic European scale?
Well, I've said, I think each day I've been here, or at least that I was awake, that this is a giant Ponzi scheme. And you can see that everything was driven by how do we continue to grow. For airplanes, we say speed is life. For a Ponzi scheme, growth is life. And that, by the way, in the savings and loan, what we did was adopt a rule Now, the rule is absurd, and it will tell you something about how hard it was to get a rule through 2 of our board members. It restricted growth to 25% a year, which is ludicrously high, but it wasn't high enough for the Ponzi's to survive. And so it killed every Ponzi that we couldn't get to because we ran out of money. And so one of the simple things that you want your regulators to do is to
I'm just interested in retroactive laws. There's a possibility that we might have to pass some retroactive laws. Is there like some guidelines or limitations? I mean, the general public perceive this as being theft, but it's maybe not anything we can do legally. But you mentioned retroactive laws.
Yes, and again, I'm not an Icelandic lawyer. I'm not close to an Icelandic lawyer. I don't know what your provisions are, but I know that retroactivity is always an issue internationally. It's an issue in our country. And so in some places, as long as it was a crime, you can come back and change some aspects of how you can use the criminal laws. That would be true of the administrative process. But in the United States context, you couldn't make something that was not a crime when they committed it a crime later, and you can understand why that would be outrageous. And I'm sure that whether or not Iceland has such a provision, the EU has provisions under its human right interpretation that would stop that kind of ex post facto law.
Yes, sir.
Yes, more mix-up. The landscape, maybe in like 205, 206, and 207, was fairly reminiscent of the landscape in the States, 85, 86, 87, during the Milken era,
Yes.
Minister Mons, etc. Do you think that a similar build-up was going on in the sense that, well, like for example, having read Den of Thieves, it seemed that they, even though they were parking money, that I never perceived, at least from my perspective, that they actually thought that they would one day lose and would try to grab the money and run. Do you think that that was happening during that era?
Okay, so, sorry, I talked over you. Drexel Burnham Lambert is a very good case for this. Michael Milken was the most prominent, powerful person in Drexel Burnham Lambert. This is the junk bond king. And Mike Milken is fabulously wealthy today. And he is considered respectable by a large portion of society today. He got reduced prison time, in part because he had a form of cancer that fortunately has stayed largely in remission. And he used, as I think you're intimating, a network of other enterprises which he actually controlled. And by the way, Lincoln Savings of Charles Keating was one of these, to make sure that business deals always seem to work. So yes, it's very reminiscent of what the commission report here has shown about the operations of the big three.
Gisli.
Thank you for your excellent lecture, Professor Black. My name is Gisli Tryggvason. I'm a consumer spokesman in Iceland.
Well, you must have nothing to do.
My former question is whether, when you are talking about recovery, you are both talking about consumers' claims and official claims by the state, for example. And my second question is how you get these consumers' claims made in court. In my view, there are two main ways to do this. One is to get a claim into the criminal procedures, which will arise, as I pointed out in my website. The second is to have a retroactive class action law, which is permissible in my view, because it's only procedural. Do you agree with me that a class action law can be retroactive?
Under Icelandic law? I don't know. I can see that there's a serious argument that it could be. We could do that probably in the United States. Right? So it was already a wrong, and we're simply providing a remedy for that. So in the United States, that would probably pass constitutional muster. The first point, it depends on the circumstances. In the United States circumstances, we were dealing with insured institutions. So the consumer was paid because it was insured in full, and consumers didn't lose in our crisis. And then, indeed, in jargon, we were subrogated into the rights of the consumer, which means we stood in the shoes of the consumer and we could assert their claims, and we did, against the frauds. That's actually a much more effective way to bring these actions, is if you can actually authorize the public authority to sue on your behalf. Because otherwise, class actions, even if you authorize them, are much harder to get going, typically. And there are always problems with the lawyers, to be blunt. As you may know, 2 of the leading class action plaintiff lawyers in America are residing in prison currently.
My name is Blumwood. It becomes very clear from your presentation the importance of hiring good consultants and specialized experts, looking into all directions. Do you think that there is some truth in the old saying, it takes a beat to catch the
Well, this brings to mind a famous story in the United States where President Roosevelt, the FDR version of Roosevelt, appointed Joseph Kennedy to head the Securities and Exchange Commission under the express logic, he knows where the bodies are buried.
Yesterday that sunlight was the best disinfectant, and I totally agree with that. There is a sort of a carousel going on in the United States, in my opinion, between the Treasury Secretary, the Federal Reserve, and Wall Street. Timothy Geithner being just one of many examples of that, or Hanks another one. Do you think that that might be something that should be looked into further, like, for instance, Ron Paul has been suggesting price control for decades? Because if you look at money supply in the US, you could come to the conclusion, seeing that it's growing exponentially, that too is a Ponzi scheme.
All right, I can answer this. So, at the large law firm I started at, I was considered an expert in what was referred to at the firm as CLGs, career limiting gestures. So I have publicly called for the president to get rid of Bernanke and Geithner. Of course it happened because I called for it. And I am a signatory of support for Ron Paul's amendment to audit the Fed. So I'm with you, brother.
Representing myself,
I was wondering whether you were about to serve a subpoena on me. Charles Keating, in addition to other things, hired private detectives twice to investigate me and sued me for $400 million in my individual capacity. So you can see why I wonder when people start getting the paper out.
I can assure you I have no intention of but thank you for another excellent lecture. But I have a question about British law that you might be familiar with. And my question is that you are familiar with any provision in the British law or maybe in a treaty between Britain and the tax havens related to Britain, like for example, Guernsey, Jersey, the Virgin Islands, and so forth, that would permit the British government to demand a release or the opening of the books of institutions and the suspect of fraud or tax evasion in those tax havens.
Yes, Britain is a signatory to a cooperative treaty that was pushed largely in truth by United States pressure. And the United States, of course, is as well. So if you can find a way to take advantage of the U.S. or the U.K. laws and get them, they can make such a request for assistance and the release of information. And you're quite right, that's an important thing in this context. Even if you get an order that says you can take the assets, you have to find the assets, and then you have to be able to, we call it levy on those assets. So yes, that could be very helpful with regard to tax havens. And of course, the fact that people are using tax havens to hide assets tells you a great deal about the people.
For your lecture. My name is Snorri Agnarsson, and I'd like to ask you some questions about the situation in the U.S. In particular, there are three things that I've noticed now that are happening in the financial system there. That SEC now is going after Goldman Sachs, one thing, and CFTC seems to be considering going after some manipulation of the market, and even Department of Justice perhaps going after some. Perhaps, yes. Do you see anything happening there, or I would like to ask you to speculate on what is going to happen in the near future?
Well, taking away the word speculate, had I not been here yesterday, I would have been testifying in front of our U.S. Senate. And I filed written testimony with them, so I testified in that sense. And if people are interested, they can see my views at some length about the role of fraud in the U.S. crisis. Yes, what I have been telling people is, in the last 5 weeks, now it's 6 weeks, in the United States, we finally started looking at a number of our most elite players. And we haven't looked all that intensively compared to during the savings and loan days, and we've already found strong evidence of fraud at 7 for 7 of the major players looked at, with an iffy as to the rating agencies. It's really hard to bring a fraud action against them, because I don't know if you've ever read a rating agency thing. At the end of it, it says, by the way, you can't rely on anything we say. This is a worthless piece of paper. So it's harder to sue people for fraud in those circumstances. Yes, there's a change. People are starting to look at these elites as frauds. There's huge pressure coming to the Justice Department. Why are there no indictments? Why are there no convictions? And the contrast to the savings and loan response with over 1,000 priority convictions is being thrown in their face every other day.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Christine Wallace. We had a visitor here on the day that the report came out, so a lot of people missed it. He gave a lecture about system dynamics and looking at the backing of currencies with precious metals. And he's not only an academic, but also the director of the largest mining company in Northern Europe. So he has a lot of information about the availability and indeed how much of these precious metals have been mined through history. And he has found that a huge amount of paper gold and paper platinum and paper various other precious metals, and predicts that there's a big banking crisis coming up again once that is discovered. What is your opinion of that?
I don't know. That's news to me, but have to investigate the fact. It's a good place to be from.
You were talking about not rewarding the guys who were here at the beginning to destroy everything. Bjarni Ármannsson, he left before the crisis started. Then he came back and he paid 150 million, I think, for saying I'm a good guy. There was an article in Fréttablaðið last week. He owns here in this country most of the propane gas. And he is selling it on the old price, he says. But I don't know if Iceland doesn't know. Gas prices are going down now almost 50% for the last 2 months. And they are still paying. What are they for this guy? And he's still playing.
Well, again, until you actually bring in the equivalent of an indictment and have the government of Iceland formally charging people and using the F word, until you have reports that actually use the F word, fraud, you're going to have this back and forth of, oh no, he's just a misunderstood. These are misunderstood assets. They would have been brilliant if, if in 2 more years of this Ponzi scheme, everything would have been great. 40 times GDP. The banks. Things would have been wonderful. We would have been not only the richest people in the world, we would have been the richest people in the galaxy. Type of thing here in Iceland. I will tell you the story in the United States that's similar. Scrushy, Mr. Scrushy was the CEO of Health South, a very large fraud. 5 CFOs pled guilty and testified under oath that Scrushy ordered them to cook the books, to engage in accounting fraud. And the defendant was tried in his local community, where he suddenly started giving all kinds of nice things to people, and especially as it turned out the black churches, and more of the jurors were African American, and he got off. Michael Milken, when he became the subject of a criminal investigation, began taking thousands of poor kids to baseball games in America. He was a great humanitarian. Don't brag.
Very nice listening to you, but you talked about the need of courageous people and honest people to do the job. That didn't make us optimistic. So we are sitting here in the university where the strongest symbol, or one of the strongest symbols, is a guy sitting on a seat, beating him on the head with a book. And the story behind that guy, he was in France studying, and he had to have some transportation to Iceland, and he made a contract to another person to bring him over to Iceland, and that person was the devil. And when he came to Iceland, he used that book to get away from the contract, if I understand the story right. And it seems to me that according to the things happening in Iceland today, the whole academy is doing the same thing. So, you see, I just wanted to mention that we need trust and we need courageous people, and I hope that they can be found in universities like this, even though I'm not very optimistic.
Well, let's start out. It's perhaps not random that I have met with a huge number of government of Iceland prosecutors, regulators, but no one in the regulatory or prosecutorial ranks in the United States has ever wanted to talk to me since I did these things. Second, yes, one of the great aspects of Iceland is its captains. And this is one of the most dangerous activities you can imagine. And Iceland, it's inherently, if you're doing it in Hawaii, where it's nice. Here, it's crazy to be a captain, and your captains go out every day in terrible weather, often. And you have to exactly draw on that tradition, those people, that kind of background. So in symbols, the symbol of the school where I was trained is the wolverine. I don't know if people know the wolverine. It's a little animal, but it is known for taking on bears. It is absolutely tenacious, but it's also intelligent. And that's, you need wolverines and you need captains.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Yesterday you talked about transparency, the importance of transparency. The transparency in the 3 banks today has never been as good as today. So my question is, how do we get rid of this government that allows this to happen?
I'm not going to advise Icelandic people on how to get rid of their government. I think that's, for anybody a stretch, and for an American, that's just, I'm not going to go there. I don't think you want the Americans to tell you how to run your country.
My name is Harald. I'm want to ask, do you have an opinion on, from your speech, it seems very clear that very serious fraud on big scale has been committed. But why are the Icelandic authorities hesitating such a long time? Is it because they are infiltrated in the fraud and don't want it to be discovered to much extent, or is it a weakness of Icelandic law in general, or is it just that it seems that the special prosecutor doesn't even read newspapers to find out suspects, which seem to be very obvious. Where's the, or are the politicians waiting for the time to run out for their own steps to be wiped over?
All right, by the tides, right? When they come in. All right. Actually, I'll disagree a bit. I think that it's remarkable that you got this investigative commission report. I think it's really remarkable. I have, as you know, had my criticisms, but it's an extraordinary document in terms of providing many, many critical facts. It is deeply embarrassing to many powerful people in this nation. And I understand that the Icelandic portions, which I can't read, are even more so in some ways, that they name names about people who, in Parliament, who got huge loans and never paid them back, right? Which can be a way of influencing politicians, let us say. So there's that, and with the aid of Madame Joly, who is superb, it's created a political dynamic, it looks to me, not an expert in your politics, in which she has been able, with the aid of the special prosecutor, working together, and doubtless many political officials, to get a dramatic increase in the planned staff, because the planned staff was a joke. Now, it may not have been a deliberate joke. People that don't understand this field have no idea how massive a commitment it requires. On Enron, we had 100 professionals, for example, investigating Enron, to give you an idea of scope. we had 1,000 professionals total looking at the savings and loan crisis. Just in the law enforcement, that's not counting us as regulators. So these are huge commitments. You have an obvious difficulty of where, I mean, some of the numbers now they're saying they want to increase the special prosecutor to 80 professionals. Well, where are you going to get 80 professionals who have prosecutorial experience against elite white-collar criminals and have a good understanding of finance and accounting?
Learn fast.
Learn fast. Okay, well that's...
At the same time, the people in big picture...
That might work for, as the captain, it might not.
How the legal system in Iceland are not capable of dealing with this. So, what is your advice for us to get the system?
I'm not sure I fully understood. Are you asking about the courts, the judicial system, or the prosecutors? All of the above. The prosecutors that I've met with are committed to doing this, and I think it's real. Right? I talk with them in smaller groupings with all senior staff, and people are engaged. They're not going, oh, when is this guy going to leave? You know, type of thing. They're talking among each other because, of course, they can't tell me of confidential matters, but they're talking with each other about the confidential matters and saying, ah, yes, what he's saying here, that actually applies to this case. And, of course, they can talk in front of me confidentially because they can do it in Icelandic and I have no clue what they're saying. So I think the obvious question is, are they going to get the staff of experienced people? Because it's the experience and expertise that you're going to have problems with. You can get 80 lawyers, but are you going to have people that can go up against the absolute best white-collar defense lawyers? And the second question is the judiciary. Will the judiciary actually be willing to look at people that look respectable, look like the most elite people in Iceland, and say, no, if the facts show it, you're a fraud and you're going to prison?
Já, það voru þarna tvö, voru það ekki, jú. Gjör svo vel, já.
My name is Jakobina Ólafsdóttir, and I find it interesting to look at the imbalances in the system that are creating a situation like we're facing today. One of the problems for the common public is that there are people taking risks, and then there are others paying. Those who didn't take any risks may be paid. And like I said, to me it's a bit like if a bank in Britain went broke, and then they would decide to make one suburb in London pay the price. Because Europe was the playing ground, but then just Iceland is supposed to take all the responsibility. And I think this is a general problem with the whole system in the banking. That you go after the group, but you also go after the public tax payment. And I'm sort of thinking about the future, whether there's a way to work against this system that goes after our children, really. Thank you.
Okay. In the savings and loan crisis, there was a talk show, and one person famously said to the host, "We shouldn't pay as taxpayers, the government should pay." We are the government. We are the taxpayers. So there isn't any magic way of not having the taxpayers pay when you get a catastrophe of this regard. That's why the focus about going forward. why you need an effective regulator who is in no way steps back from, here the regulators were outright cheerleaders. It was a complete disgrace. I've looked at a number of their speeches in English. They're terrible, right? You cannot put people like that in charge, or we'll be meeting again, but it'll be in Poland or wherever you've emigrated to.
Okay, I think, Professor, our time is up. It's almost 1:30, and I'm famous for sticking within the schedule and never go over the time. It's my trademark. So
alles muss in Ordnung sein.
Yeah. And then this has been an important dialogue. In my view, it is a dialogue that must take place within our rules of law, and we must never forget the main principle of due process and burden of proof. However, today, Professor Black has given us new and fresh ideas, a new perspective. And having said that, I would like to conclude this session by first of all thanking Professor Black for his valuable input. So thank you. And you, of course, you all, because this has been an important dialogue and we need this dialogue at this time in our society. So thank you.